Hi there, everyone. I'm back with the last kind of thematic lecture of the course. I'll put out one more on a bit of a short notice. Put it out on Wednesday to wrap things up because Wednesday is the last day the classes meet. But that will be that. I really don't need or intend to have a long-winded introduction to this. Some of this stuff is going to tie into material we've already talked about. A lot of it's going to be quite new, and I think it's probably just best to go ahead and get on into it. Uh, so what I've chosen to cover, and what I hope to be a relatively brief video compared to some, are the attempts in the past to uncover, I don't know, kind of a secret sauce of economic development. Uh, One of the interesting questions, the many interesting questions available to us in international relations and international political economy. How do states go from being relatively impoverished ones uh, to, in a span of a few decades or less than a century, world leaders? And that's an incredible turnaround. Yet it does happen. Uh, the following might help you give some context as to what I'm thinking. So after the end of the Second World War, the per person level of wealth in India and South Korea were pretty much identical. But today, South Korea is an emerging leader in a number of high tech sectors. Its population's per person wealth has grown immensely. Meanwhile, in India, despite a larger population, larger territory, it continues to experience high levels of poverty, especially in its considerable countryside, the rural areas. Uh, so that's kind of we can't do too many experiments with political science, but this is one of the ones we can go back to and we can say, in the beginning, they had a lot of similarities. Time goes by and we have very different outcomes. So what is it that caused that outcome? Why did South Korea, again, relatively small with respect to land, relatively small population, again, compared to India, not uh, hugely gifted when it comes to natural resources, how were they able to grow so much faster than India? Or maybe the question is, why didn't India grow faster? Well, uh, we'll see, right? That's why we study these things. Uh, but countries go on very different trajectories based in large part on the policies that they choose to pursue. I've identified some of the major schools of thought you see on their stages of growth, which comes out of modernization theory. There's also, the dependency theory, and finally the kind of neoliberal reformist movement. These are the big strands of thinking in post-World War II economic development circles. Really, through the early 2000s, it was some or all part of those theories, and they all have big weaknesses. And so part of what I'm getting at is that I'll just give you the answer up front. There isn't really a single answer yet to how countries grow more rapidly than others. If you look at any one case, as economic historians can, they can cite a bunch of factors that might explain it, but those factors could also be present in other countries where growth did not happen. And so empirically, they're pretty weak explanations. If the same factor is present in a successful case and in a case of failure or less success, then that really undermines the strength of that variable as a causal explanation for growth, because it was present in other conditions and it didn't produce it. Uh, the U.S.-led coalition of countries in the post-World War II world made a political decision to focus on global economic development. And this is a bit strange. I mean, on the face of it, particularly if we were approaching this from the kind of realist theory of international relations, states probably wouldn't want to help others grow richer. Realists would point out that other countries growing would lead to a reduction in the relative economic power of those who facilitated them, assuming that the developing countries are growing at a higher rate than those who were already more advanced. In theory, right, that's a fine critique, but theory is that, and we need to test it against the real world. So, why countries actually supported post-World War II growth? Well, at least among the richest countries who went on to form what we call the West, the West was worried about support for communism around the world. And they thought it was best to put forward pro-development strategies, policies, and also to make the resources available to make sure that developing countries didn't turn to communism. If the people and their leaders in those states saw that there were viable non-communist paths to prosperity, they would reject communism, in large part because of the downsides. Development was not done as charity work. It was not done as wishful thinking, but it was one part of a much larger political, military, economic effort to contain the spread of communism. Again, that's true of Western based development funding and thinking. So while the West knew what it wanted to do, it did not really know how to do it. And the policymakers in the post-World War II environment, the policymakers, again, those in the West that were committed to containing the spread of communism, had the problem of how do you get other countries, particularly developing countries, to develop. It was actually comparatively easy to get the formerly advanced countries pre-World War II to rebuild, because they still had, despite the ravages of people and infrastructure, that once they were able to rebuild, they had a lot of the technical know-how to catapult them forward to again be in that vanguard of economic development. But that's not the problem we're talking about. We're not talking about the reconstruction problem. We're talking about the development problem. And it was not at all clear how do we take countries who were, at least not recently, in the last hundreds or maybe even thousands of years, considered advanced. How do we take those countries and facilitate their growth in a way that's not going to bankrupt us in the West, because there's lots of demands for what our money should be spent on. But how do we get them to adopt which non-communist policies to keep them in our camp? Or at the very least, keep them out of the communist world's camp. The development theory that received the most support in the early Cold War is known as modernization theory. And more specifically, within modernization theory, the model was the stages of growth model that you see on your outline. Luckily for us, this, and I would say probably that the next model, are not terribly difficult, complex to understand. The assumption of stages of growth was that all states were moving on a linear path of development. Now, not all states were at the same point, but that all states at some point, if they hadn't already, were going to go through the phases that others had gone through. And the key to development, from moving from, say, the poorest of countries to modernizing to modernized and fully advanced, the key determinant was national savings. High national savings would enable the government to make the necessary growth-oriented investments in infrastructure and in education and in public health that were believed to be necessary in order for countries to advance. The stages of growth model propose that developing countries use economic policy to encourage high savings and increase exports to acquire the necessary capital to invest. Trying to encourage national savings is one thing, but savings was not always feasible in practice in countries with low incomes and high poverty rates. If that's your starting place, and again, many of these former colonial countries, even where they weren't, though, high poverty rates, low incomes were the norm, among other challenges. Where are you going to get a lot of savings in that kind of situation? There wasn't much to be had. So a solution to that was to loan money to developing countries who could invest it in productive endeavors, again, the education, the public infrastructure, public health, and those borrowings could be repaid over time as their economies grew from those productive investments. So that was a intellectually plausible model. It could work. But as with lots of these things, the answer to one question led to others. So where's the money going to come from that the developing world needs? I mean, in its the kind of simplest articulation of it, developing countries are developing, not advanced, because they lack capital. All right? If they're capital poor, there's not a lot within their population to get it from, so the solution is you got to get capital from somewhere else. Where else? Western banks, at that time, and to a degree today, were the ones with capital to lend. Less so today in relative terms than 1950s and 60s. The World Bank. Okay, I know I said that there's no such thing called the World Bank, but the World Bank Group, all of those organizations associated with it. It was eager to lend, as the IBRD, now you know what that means from that lecture. The IBRD operates like a private bank. It needs to make loans. So it was eager to lend, and then the development arms, as they were added, had specific targets to help developing, least developed countries sometimes access to capital. The economies in Western Europe no longer really needed World Bank funding for reconstruction. By the late 1950s, their borrowing needs were not as great as their economies, as I mentioned, had largely rebuilt from the World War II era destruction. And remember, at that point, the late 1950s, the early 1960s, decolonization was very much underway, and a number of the newly independent countries wanted access to capital, loans, to make investments in their country. So the World Bank began partnering with some of these countries, but most capital did not come from the World Bank Group. It came from large private, usually Western banks, who in total had far more capital to lend the developing world than, again, the quote-unquote World Bank, the World Bank Group. But there's your model. I mean, developing countries need capital. Savings would be best, but where there's not a lot of income, there's not the administrative capacity to collect taxes, and so on. In the short term, you got to borrow, make productive investments, and hope that those investments pay off, and you'll pay off the debts in the future, hopefully from a much enlarged economy. It's a fair question to ask. Right? That was the policy. It was followed. How did it do? And to its credit, and as you'll see with all of these, there are always success cases, and there are almost always failures. It's always a question of, well, how widespread is the success or failure, and how spectacular was the success or failure. Well, Stages of Growth had a number of notable successes. It may or may not have been due to the Stages of Growth recommendations. Countries such as South Korea, Indonesia, and Turkey, among others, appeared to be taking the Stages of Growth model pretty well, and it seemed to be working in their economies. However, other countries were struggling to repay their debts, especially, I should say, to private banks. The investments they made did not deliver the expected returns. In many cases, the funds that were borrowed from foreign banks were siphoned off by government officials through, frankly, corruption. This led some individuals in developing countries to get fantastically wealthy, but the rest of the country was stuck paying the bill to those foreign banks, or to the World Bank, or whoever they had borrowed from, as the case may have been. So it's in this context that a group of scholars, primarily from South America, developed the theory I believe I talked a little bit about previously. This is the dependency theory. They saw debt repayments from developing countries to Western banks as the explanation for why many developing countries were in fact not developing, as the name kind of implies that they are. Debt repayments were taking up a lot of the capital that was supposed to be saved and reinvested back into developing countries to actually allow them to grow. However, in some cases, crippling debt burdens that developing countries had assumed for one reason or another. And again, you really need to know the context to know why some countries were more heavily indebted than others. But those debt repayments were constantly sucking the capital out of these developing countries, and in many cases were being sent overseas back to those Western banks as profits for the banks, dividends for shareholders, and all that. Dependency theorists went on to argue that the international trade system in general was disadvantaged with respect to developing countries, because developing countries, by and large, would only sell low-value, frequently primary products, but were expected to import high-value finished goods from the West. So what ended up occurring is that developing countries exported relatively little of value, but in an effort to try to catch up and to begin developing, they imported much more expensive and high volumes of goods, primarily from the West. And because the value of what they imported frequently exceeded the value of what they exported, they had to pay for it with, what do you always pay debt with? You had to borrow. And so it was yet more lending from the West frequently to those in developing countries. The dependency theorist scholars actually accepted the core argument at the heart of the Stages of Growth model. Developing states needed to save their capital in order to invest and grow. They weren't disputing the kind of policy solution. Where they differed with the policies, where they differed with the Stages of Growth folks, is the policies that were likely going to produce that. When it came to trade, dependency theorists recommended developing countries stop relying on expensive Western imports, but rather develop their own finished products. This reliance on self-produced products is an example of what's known as import substitution industrialization. Some developing countries make their own substitutes for the goods they previously imported. So I'll just use a really generic example. Countries don't want to import, refrigerators or fax machines or cars. So They're going to build their own refrigerators and their own cars and whatever else it is that they don't want to import. They'll have domestic producers produce whatever it is they can that will make up for that. And that would help developing countries disentangle themselves from what dependency theorists saw as, at its core, an exploitive relationship, where the developed world got cheap primary products from the developing countries, sold tremendous more to them, and also were the financiers of that developing country debt. And that debt, on top of whatever had been borrowed for development, reached crippling proportions in many developing countries. And one debt or one loan just gave rise to a new loan, an additional debt that the developing countries were expected to pay. So for dependency theorists, the solution is to try to cut yourselves out of that trading system as much as you can, designing your own would-be imports so you don't have to rely on the West, and perhaps building up some of your manufacturing base so that you can export more than, if you're going to focus on exporting, focus on more than just primary products. And it might make more sense to trade with other developing countries who are at similar income levels, development levels, than continuing to trade as heavily with the West. All right, just as we did with stages of growth, it's fair to ask, for the countries who followed a lot of that policy advice, how did it go? And again, you can always find successes and failures, but overall, I would say, based on the evidence, it did not go all that well. And there are a couple of reasons why you can see it won't go that well. One is that there's another development theory that comes after it. So if you kind of tell that if dependency theory had all the answers, and even one state tried it and it worked, given how many countries were trying to develop, you would assume that it would be more widespread. And if dependency theory's policies generally played out well, then we wouldn't have needed the neoliberal solution or the Washington consensus policies that come along with it. So that's just a little bit of context to help you get at the answer. But it does not work out all that well in practice. One comparison of the countries who practiced import substitution industrialization to those who did not found that the countries who practiced ISI frequently ended up with higher levels of debt and higher levels of poverty compared to those who remained more integrated into the ever-increasing globalizing economy. And on top of all of that, some countries' faith in ISI and dependency theory began to deteriorate as events unfolded, and there's a new crisis coming down the pike. And so, excuse me, as I pointed out to you earlier in the semester, when one theory becomes apparently disproven, it opens up a space or a spot for new theories that maybe otherwise would not have been noticed to have their shot. And in this case, history kind of intervenes to cast a lot of doubt on the validity of dependency theory as a reliable theory of how countries ought to develop. And it really wasn't just one, it was really two major crises that affected developing countries in the 1980s. I previously did a lecture on energy geopolitics, and I kind of covered some of this, but not all of it. So to fill in some of the parts I don't think I covered as well, developing countries that produced a lot of oil, Mexico, Venezuela, Libya, and others, did very well economically during the high oil prices of the 1970s, if you can remember that part of that lecture. Mexico borrowed heavily to expand its oil production capabilities, believing that those loans would pay off in the future as Mexico would be able to sell more expensive oil. But things changed, and kind of unexpectedly. So U.S. in the late 70s, early 80s was experiencing really high inflation, in part because of high oil prices. The Federal Reserve in the United States raised its interest rates to help get rid of that high inflation. And in a sense, it worked, but it did so while driving the U.S. and other countries into a recession in the early to mid-1980s. Developing countries who sought out new loans to repay old ones now faced much higher interest rates. Because of the drop in oil demand due to the U.S. recession and the stronger dollar, and oil was priced in U.S. dollars, the price of a barrel of oil plummeted. So oil reliant, that is oil exporting reliant developing countries now had less money coming in. The oil that they were selling was not bringing in as much money, but because of the higher interest rates charged on debt, they had to pay more when it came to financing their existing or any new debts. This put those highly indebted developing countries at the risk of not being able to repay what they had borrowed. So it's easy to say, and I get it, well, why not just let those developing countries declare bankruptcy and, let them go to their creditors, and they'll figure out some sort of deal. Their creditors will get some of their money, but not all of it. Well, that's easy to say, but it's harder to do. And at this time, it was particularly hard for the United States to not get involved in this, because in many cases, the creditors of those developing countries were American banks. And if the developing countries didn't repay the U.S. banks, those U.S. banks would then be short of capital, and it could lead to a banking or other financial crisis in the United States. Letting developing countries default on their debt was out of the question for the United States, but as with other things, we've answered that question, but what's the solution? How to get developing countries out of their debt? It's worth mentioning, just before we pass on this point, about how developing countries are going to pay. The concern about the kind of spillover effect of oil-reliant developing countries not repaying their debts to American banks as a cause of banking crisis in the United States. As the 1980s actually happened, largely as a result of some deregulation policies of the Reagan administration, as well as the actions of individuals and banks, there were already two banking crises that actually happened. And again, this is all with the benefit of hindsight. They didn't know it at the time. But it's not that far-fetched to assume that this could have contributed to yet a third major banking crisis in less than a decade. And that would have been, well, that would have been bad, needless to say. But I'll say it anyway.